Hello, everybody. Time for the next chapter, our daily bread. The day in the farm started at about 7 a.m. with a quick cup of tea. Then, when the cows had been milked and my father had gone to the creamery, the rest of us sat down to a long, leisurely breakfast. Preparations for dinner meant going to the field where the potatoes and vegetables grew and digging a bucket of potatoes and cutting some heads of cabbage. A big black pot of potatoes was boiled every day, and whatever was left went with the other scraps to feed the farm dogs and the pigs. Dinner itself was at 1 o'clock, and a shrill iron whistle that hung beside the kitchen door summoned us. We could hear it fields away. At 4 o'clock we had afternoon tea, and whatever time the cows were milked in the evening was supper time. The evening milking was a restful moment in the day. Men and women, tired after their work, slapped their little milking stools on the ground beside the cows. We called the stool the block, maybe because it consisted of a 2-inch block of solid timber with 3 legs broadening out at the base to give balance. Having made sure that your block was secure, you sat down with the bucket between your knees and rested your forehead against the soft, silken flank of the cow. Then, wrapping your fingers around the cow's warm teats, you milked to a steady, soothing rhythm. At first, the milk hit the tin bucket with a sharp, metallic sound, but as it filled, it mellowed to a drowsy hum, and the cold bucket grew warm between your legs. Milking time was singing time. It was debating time if your fellow milkers felt so inclined, or it could be just dreaming time. If, however, the cow felt that her presence was being ignored, she could draw a sharp kick and send you sprawling into the centre channel of the stalls, baptizing you with a bucket of warm milk. Most were tranquil animals, but we had a few of what my father called kickers. Each cow had a name, and the kicking strain could follow from mother to daughter, and often we had a mother and daughter in the one herd. The cows were of many different strains and colours. Specialisation had not yet come in. We had a family called legs. These were long-legged white cows, and the other white cows were termed Bainey. There was a strain of small brown ones we called mouse, and we had both a mother mouse and a young mouse. I liked the mother mouse particularly because she was so quiet and easygoing and never kicked. We carried the buckets full of milk to the churns, which we called tanks, on the stand outside the stalls, and around the top of each tank was a muslin cloth through which we strained the milk. When Dan was staying, he, rather than my father, might sometimes take the milk to the creamery. However, this occasionally led to problems. These were the early days of hygiene inspectors, and Dan resented inspectors in any form. He absolutely refused to allow any inspection of our tanks, demanding to know of them, "What did you ever do for your country that entitled you to go round smelling our milk?" After such an altercation, a hurried SOS would come from the creamery to channel Dan in another direction. In early spring or late autumn, when milk production was at its lowest, we separated our own milk and made butter. We poured the milk, still warm from the cow, into the separator, a large iron dish with 2 pipes, which was attached to a motor with a handle. It gave off a soft whine when the handle was turned, and out of one pipe came cream, out of the other skim milk. It was a simple but ingenious device, and while my father manned it, we young ones lined up with cups for drinks of cream. On the following day, the cream was put into the churn to make butter. We had 2 churns, a hand one which sat on a table and could be worked by one person, and a barrel churn which stood on a stand and required 2 churners, though if woman power was scarce, which seldom happened, one could manage it. After a certain amount of churning, the thick cream formed into lumps of butter. The faster one could achieve this, the better the butter, and this was the source of the country saying that long churning makes bad butter, a saying which was considered applicable to many situations in life. The butter made, it was washed and salted. What remained in the churn was buttermilk, a grand drink on a hot summer day and a great favourite of the men coming in from the fields. The crops we had planted in spring grew through the summer months, and as they ripened, the differences between them became evident. The wheat was a golden brown, the oats a butter yellow, and the barley, with its bearded head, the old man of the 3. Cutting the corn in the autumn meant the winding down of the year's work, and it was a task in which the neighbours came together and helped each other out. When the corn had been cut and bound into sheaves, stooks were made, and finally handstacks. Then the handstacks were drawn home with the horse and float, and the different ricks, or reeks as we called them, were made. The threshing was one of the biggest events of the farming year. The sowing of the seeds in the spring, followed by the cutting of the corn, were all a build-up to this point. Now the wheat would be threshed into grain, which would in turn be ground into flour to give us our daily bread. Coming home from school through the fields, we heard the hum of the thresher in the different farmyards and counted the days until it would pull into our haggard. Finally, on coming home one evening, we would be told that the threshing machine was coming to our farm that night. We waited in the haggard and kept our ears strained for the sound of the old engine, our eyes peeled for the sight of the smoke above the trees. Living still in the age of the horse, anything motorised that moved on wheels on the farm was to us a kind of miracle. At last we heard the engine grumbling its way along and saw the high pink-timbered threshing machine between the hedges. As I watched it coming down the laneway, I felt thrills of anticipation shooting out through my toes. Getting the long, unwieldy paraphernalia into the haggard was a slow and complicated ordeal, and it was a great place to be if you wanted to learn any new curses. The greasy, overalled engine men twisted and manoeuvred this iron monster, which all the time belched smoke and spluttered in protest. Finally, after much discussion and pacing of distances, the most suitable position was achieved. She was set and ready for action the following morning. After breakfast, the engine was coaxed into life, and as it coughed and finally roared, it sent out smoke signals that brought the men from miles around. They came from across the river, down from the hill, across the fields and down the laneway. They were weather-beaten, work-hardened men, and each one carried a pike. They came at a lively pace with a hunger for work in their stride. The threshing was a test of working skills in which men showed their mettle, and, even though they often worked hard days at home, they did not always have such an audience. It was also one of the most sociable days of the year, for some of these men met only at threshings, and so had a year's events to discuss. Some of them opened the reek and threw the sheaves to those on top of the thresher. At the back of the thresher, where the straw poured out, was one of the toughest jobs in piking away the straw. Here, a reek of straw was made, and as the reek of corn reduced in size, this rose higher. There was skill in making a well-balanced reek. The story of the harvest was told at the front of the thresher. Here, the golden grain poured out of little trapdoors into jute bags. This was where my father took control. He scooped up the first grains anxiously into his fist and examined them on the palm of his hand. Then he put a few into his mouth and chewed them thoughtfully, with his eyes closed. He was like a connoisseur sampling wine as he tested his year's work. Finally, he opened his eyes and, rubbing his hands together, declared, "Great stuff, that." It was lovely to watch the gold grain pour into the nut-brown bags. When it was about 4 inches from the top, we quickly changed bags, and then the full bags were carried on the backs of the men across the haggard to the loft, a long, low stone building with a timber floor. The grain was poured from the open bags onto the floor, starting at the back wall. As the bags were open-mouthed on their backs, the men just bent forward without removing them, and the grain poured out over their shoulders. I helped my father switching the bags at the mouth of the thresher, and a sense of togetherness and harmony, with the satisfaction of a job well done, built up between us during the day. All that day the thresher droned, and the men worked steadily, breaking only for dinner and tea. It took large supplies to feed the hungry mehel, the group of neighbours who had come to work with us, and if Napoleon believed that an army marched on its stomach, my mother believed that the threshing men worked on theirs. There was an air of good fellowship and fun, both in the haggard and around the kitchen table. At the side of the thresher, a large pile of chaff, feather-like bits of straw and empty ears of corn, built up, and here, after school, the neighbouring children played, burrowing into it and throwing it at each other, while the men shouted at them to get out of the way. The haggard was the realm of the men and children to which the women, busy in the kitchen, rarely came. Gradually, as the reeks of corn disappeared and the reeks of straw towered high, the threshing wound down. We children were sorry to hear it shuddering to a halt. Then the men helped to get the thresher and engine out, a complicated business because the wheels were so heavy that sometimes they sank into the soft ground. After much pushing and shunting, she finally got going, and it was with a sense of sadness that I watched the whole gangling procession steam its way up the passage. The top-heavy thresher frequently swayed at precarious angles, but always recovered in time to right itself. The threshing was over for another year, and the men went home to their various farms to milk the cows, their children with them. The haggard, a hue of different shades of yellow and brown, was silent at last. The bright yellow straw, the soft yellow chaff, and the rich dark earth where the wheels of the thresher had cut. My father stood with one hand on his hip and the other rubbing the base of his neck. It was his stance when everything was right in his world. He walked to the open door of the loft where the rich-coloured grain spread out in waves to the four corners. I stood beside him, silent lest I break the magic of his moment of inner peace. He was a man who was often aggravated by some of the aspects of farming, But at times like this he reached a high plateau of fulfilment, and later he and my mother would go together to view the loft. When the geese and ducks arrived back for the night from the fields, there were shrieks of joy, for the haggard after threshing was a haven of rare delight for them. They screeched and they quacked and they tore into the chaff with all the sounds of ecstasy. They ate it, they burrowed into it, and they rolled over in it. Such was their harvest Thanksgiving. Later, some of the grain was taken to the mill for crushing. A large quantity of the oats was left as it was to be fed to the hens and horses. The crushed oats and barley were used to feed the pigs and some of the cows, and the wheat was milled for flour. Some of the wheat was sold, and more returned for our own use. My mother baked every day, big circles of brown and white bread baked in the bastables over the fire. Shop bread rarely appeared on our table. She made big currant cakes and apple cakes with the apples from our own orchard. We had huge old apple trees that produced an abundance of fruit, which my mother stored in boxes in the loft. They seldom had time to dry out as our consumption was heavy and demand always exceeded supply. After a stormy night, the pigs had a feast in the orchard, eating the windfalls. But when my brothers started beekeeping, the hives were under the apple trees and the pigs were forced out. They resented this infringement of their rights, but when they made any attempt to force an entrance, the bees went on the attack. I often saw the herd, with tails curled high, screeching in protest and running as fast as their short legs would carry them. Slán.